times.com.
Daryl Morris on Times Radio.
Hello there, good evening. This is Times Radio. I'm Daryl Morris, and the front pages of Monday's papers are trickling in. And our panel, standing by to whip us through them, Matthew Stadlen is a journalist and broadcaster. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, very good evening to you, Daryl.
Good evening. Alys Watson Brown is a political commentator as well. Hello, Alys.
Hi, Daryl. Thank you so much for having me on. How are you?
Oh, a pleasure. Thank you both for being here. A real joy. Let me whip you across the front pages and have a look at what's making the headlines. The Times, Monday morning, leads with a story on the NHS. Patients to face a long NHS wait for years, they say. They've also got a story about people working from home to watch the World Cup tomorrow. We'll come back to that in a moment. The Daily Telegraph also considers the NHS. Cancer toll surges in the wake of the pandemic, hundreds more than expected after missing diagnosis. The Express, Monday morning, fury as absurd idea to go soft on Brexit. That's their take on the prospect of a Swiss-style Brexit. The Mail also have that story. Don't betray us on Brexit, they say. The iPaper has a bit more detail on that and considers Rishi Sunak's take on that. He's not at all keen on the idea of a Swiss arrangement. The Guardian, climate deal still leaves world on the brink of catastrophe. They've got the latest from COP. We'll come to that as well shortly. Also, cancelled trains have hit a record high. As somebody who travels between London and Manchester on a regular basis, a story that sings to me. Finally, can we please talk about the country's trains? We will, whether you like it or not, Matthew and Alice. We're going to talk about that story before 11 tonight. And the Metro have Joe Lycett on their front page. What a waste, they say. Wad a waste, they say, as the comic shreds £10,000. We'll get onto all of that shortly. Shall we start, Matthew, with the Times and patients facing long NHS waits for years? The Times today says that patients face long waits for ambulances and accident and emergency care for years to come. Ministers now accepting they have to basically pick their battles on the NHS and just focus on a couple of services.
Yeah, it's terrifying, isn't it? The waits that we're all going to be facing, the waits for ambulances, waits in emergency care. I mean, existing targets seem to be going out of the window, and Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, wants to localise the way in which I think targets are established. That seems to me, although he would argue this is an efficiency drive, it seems to me terrifying because we can't afford to wait for ambulances, otherwise we die. Interesting, I think we need to have a conversation about our NHS, not in my view to discuss whether it should be free at the point of delivery. That element of it, I think, is as close a political sacred thing as you can get in this country. But just accountability. I mean, personally, I'm not going to go into details, but in recent weeks and months, I've experienced some of the very best of the NHS and some of the very worst. And the worst, I can tell you, is really, really terrifyingly bad. So I don't think it should be protected from criticism. That said, it clearly needs investment. And we are in, and would have talked about this last time I was on your show, Dale, we're in a real pickle at the moment, partly because of what's going on in Ukraine and the evil of Putin, partly because of what happened in the pandemic, partly because of the disastrous month-long or whatever it was administration of Liz Truss. The question is, how do we scrape ourselves out of this, doing ourselves the least harm in the process? And also want to point out, and this will link to another story we may come to on the front page of the Eye this evening, is the idea that Brexit has been basically a disaster. And if it hasn't been a disaster, it certainly hasn't been a success. We know that the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, has predicted that long-term, Brexit is going to cause us to be 4% less productive than we would have been if we'd stayed in the EU. And that's why people are now talking about some sort of Swiss-type relationship with the EU. But when we are struggling in the way that we are, it means there's a hell of a lot less money to go around. We all know that. What do we ring fence? One thing I would ring fence, to come back to the front page of the Times, also on the front page of the Telegraph with a different twist. What would I ring fence? Well, I would ring fence emergency care, cancer care, making sure that ambulances actually arrive within 18 minutes of people calling them. Because if we don't have that, I'm not sure we can call ourselves a civilized society, certainly not a functioning society.
Okay. Alice, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I agree that everyone here probably has seen NHS at its best, but also NHS at its worst. I think we've all been there when we've been in A&E and we've waited 5 hours, be it because we're sick or because our kids are sick, and it's never, ever pleasant. I do think, however, that the problem is not that we need to invest more in the NHS, because especially since the pandemic, there has not been a positive correlation in pumping more money into the institution and sort of better performance. Waiting times have not improved. Quality of care has not improved. The amount of doctors that they're hiring has not improved, nor nurses, or working conditions for them has not improved. So I think there has to, you think, take it from a different angle, in the sense that you have to do some kind of bureaucratic restructuring. And for me, what screams out is the sort of six-figure salaries of these diversity chiefs that seem to eat up so much money, of the public purse. And secondly, if you also want to improve waiting times in A&E, is make it easier for people to get GP appointments. And that ensures that you have to put a quota in for the amount of people that GPs have to see per day. Because currently at my local GP, it's very easy to get an emergency appointment, be it if you have some deadly infection or, it's sort of life-threatening and you don't want to go to A&E. But if you want to just get a normal regular appointment for something that you're worried about, it's about a month. And obviously that means it's going to be more likely for them to go into A&E, and that just clogs up. And having a brother who is a doctor in A&E, I hear all these awful, stories day to day about how it's not just how money needs to be pumped into it, it's how it is distributed that is the more important factor.
When you say diversity chiefs, that's one person, isn't it? The diversity chief. I
think there are more than one. I think there is a team of diversity personnel that ensure that the NHS hit certain targets. I mean, I'm not sure what these targets are. They haven't actually been explicitly said in any of the press releases by the NHS, but I know they are to do with LGBTQ aspects of it, which isn't a problem in making the NHS more aware about the issues, especially with younger children when it comes to sexual identity and trans issues. But I think if we want to actually improve it at the point of delivery, I don't think the average sick person really needs to be worrying about, how over £100,000 a year goes to these people, worrying about how many people, like the quotas of that. That's just not what the NHS is for.
Okay. Matthew, Brexit is intrinsically linked to this, isn't it? As you say, the iPaper this morning, Tory MPs warned Sunak over the Swiss deal with the EU. If the Tory party thought that this issue was going away from them, that Brexit was settled for a generation, as David Cameron hoped, he's going to be extremely disappointed with the front pages of Monday's papers, because the idea of a Swiss deal seems to be cutting them right down the middle.
It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? When I was hosting my shows on LBC for years, as someone who voted Remain, I did try to persuade my listeners that I thought we had to respect the democratic mandate in this country and had to go through with Brexit. But the further down that line we've gone, the more obvious it seems to all of us. Once you strip away the fig leaves of Putin and the pandemic, the more obvious it seems to me and to, I think, the majority now of people in this country, comfortable majority, that Brexit simply isn't working. It is making us poorer. And when we have a cost of living crisis that would have happened anyway, I think it really sharpens the brain. It sharpens the focus. And so there have been these headlines suggesting, as I said earlier, that we might be trying to achieve some sort of Swiss-type deal. Switzerland, by the way, of course, hugely integrated in with the EU without being part of it, has sort of a privileged access to the single market. I think it's the fourth biggest importer or exporter for the EU, but it is part of the Schengen free travel area. And I think anyone who voted Brexit, or a lot of people who voted Brexit, would be horrified by the idea of us joining that. Not that we were part of that in the first place, but there will be many who fear that this opens the door to free movement again. The problem is when people are feeling the pinch, and millions, I'd say tens of millions of people up and down the country are now feeling the pinch. Questions about nationality, questions about immigration, yes, it's being whipped up by elements of the right-wing media, but these start to recede for many into the background, because what they really want to be able to do is put food on the table. And if they know that there's an elephant in the room in the shape of Brexit that is making it even harder for them to do that, then it starts, as I say, to focus the mind.
Okay, I'm going to let you get away with mentioning one of our competitors just once, Matthew. Once. Everybody gets one, right? No more of that. Yeah, okay, fair. You
guys have done very well in the ratings. I don't think you have anything to fear.
That's all right. No, we're punching perfectly fine. Absolutely. Alys, Matthew makes some good points there, doesn't he? And the fact of the matter is that Brexit does remain an elephant in the room with lots of these discussions around the economy and around funding things like our NHS, etc. And I suppose there is this really difficult impasse, isn't there? Which, most economists would point at the single market and say, look, the UK can't have the growth it needs or the economic recovery that it needs, certainly not in the short term without access to the single market. But then, of course, that involves sort of freedom of movement, at least to some degree, you would imagine, on the EU's part. And that feels like an impasse as well. What on earth? Go on, solve the problem, Alys, in a couple of minutes. What on earth do we do about Brexit?
I think it depends how you see it. I mean, you were saying that Brexit needs to be solved effectively because it's been the root cause of all the economic problems that we've experiencing, namely the cost of living. Personally, I would disagree with that. And I don't think that's necessarily because if I was old enough, I was 16 when the referendum happened, I probably would have voted to leave. But I think we forget about COVID and the sense that we effectively paid our population to stay at home and to not go to work. And that ultimately has quite a fundamental impact on the economy. I'm not saying Brexit did not impact how our economy runs, but I think COVID has been, in this instance, in this story, has been massively looked over.
But I think with respect... Go on, Matthew.
Could I just quickly come back on that, Alys? Because I was very clear to say that the cost of living crisis would have happened despite Brexit. So Putin's war in Ukraine.
What's your evidence for that, though?
And the pandemic. My evidence, I'm agreeing with you that even without Brexit, we would have had a cost of living crisis, because you're not keen to put the cost of living crisis down to Brexit. And I have a lot of sympathy to that. But let's look at the trusted body that is the OBR, which the Liz Truss Kwarteng mini budget basically ignored, and they lost their jobs as a result. And there was a big black hole, an additional black hole created as a consequence. The OBR, I think we can reasonably trust. They did some research last year, as I said earlier, that suggests that in the long run, not just short term or the medium term, but the long run, Brexit is going to make us 4% less productive. It is going to impact negatively our imports and our exports, but something like 15% they're going to go down. That is massive. They also did some research, and I'm sure it's not conclusive, but they did some research to suggest that the cost of the pandemic, and I imagine this is short term rather than long term, is 2% in terms of our productivity or in terms of our GDP. So in other words, Brexit is a bigger beast in all this. But that said, as someone who, we're talking about the NHS, and we're talking about Brexit, we're talking about the consequences of things, as someone who did support lockdowns when they were being mooted in the middle of the pandemic. I was one of the so-called mainstream who thought they were, although extremely painful, and I hated them personally, I thought by and large they seemed the sensible way at the time. Even though I supported them then, it is absolutely vital that we as a country, perhaps through a public inquiry, look at the way that we handled the pandemic, because there are undoubted costs to what we did. One of those costs seems to be borne out on the front page of the Telegraph this evening, and that is the idea that more people, or the fact that more people than expected, are dying of cancer. The NHS is in crisis partly, it's not just about funding, it's partly because of the way we handled the pandemic. So I hold my hands up. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong about lockdowns, but we have to look into it as a country, so that the next time there's a pandemic, heaven forbid, but I think there will be one, we know how to deal with it to the best of our ability.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll come back. Honestly, if you thought Brexit was going to be divisive, and it's split the room here, and the economic recovery, just wait until we have a conversation about Joe Lycett shredding £10,000 as he has done today. Front page of the Metro has this. Comedian Joe Lycett spots a storm, appearing to destroy. It's a key point, really, because we're not 100% sure if he actually did. £10,000 in cash as his sort of challenge to David Beckham and his demand to withdraw his official ambassador role. We'll get our panel's take on that and some other bits and bobs from the front pages on Times Radio next.
Daryl Morris on Times Radio.
Hello, good evening. Just gone 10 to 11. I'm Daryl Morris. Matthew Stadlin is a journalist and broadcaster, and Alys Watson Brown with us as well tonight to take us through some of the front pages of the papers. The Metro Monday morning has Joe Lycett. What a waste is their headline, and their take on him shredding £10,000 cash after his challenge to David Beckham to withdraw his official ambassadorship with Qatar was ignored. Now, before we get our panel's take on this, let me just play you a clip, because I think it's important for context you understand what we're talking about here. This is what Joe Lycett posted to Twitter a couple of weeks ago.
This is a message to David Beckham. I consider you, along with Kim Woodburn and Monty Don, to be a gay icon. You were the first Premiership footballer to do shoots with gay magazines like Attitude, to speak openly about your gay fans, and you married a Spice Girl, which is the gayest thing a human being can do. But now it's 2022, and you've signed a reported £10 million deal with Qatar to be their ambassador during the FIFA World Cup. Qatar was voted as one of the worst places in the world to be gay. Homosexuality is illegal, punishable by imprisonment, and if you're Muslim, possibly even death. You've always talked about the power of football as a force for good, which suggests to me that you've never seen West Brom. But generally, I agree. So with that in mind, I'm giving you a choice. If you end your relationship with Qatar, I'll donate this 10 grand of my own money, that's £1 for every million you're reportedly getting, to charities that support queer people in football. However, if you do not, at midday next Sunday, I will throw this money into a shredder just before the opening ceremony of the World Cup and stream it live on a website I've registered called benderslikebeckham.com. Not just the money, but also your status as a gay icon will be shredded. The choice is yours. I look forward to hearing from you.
Joe Lycett a couple of weeks ago, and today he did shred the cash, £10,000 of it, we believe. He appeared to do that with a shredder, with some ear protectors, and with a rainbow outfit on. Matthew, what do you think?
I think this whole area of sports washing is absolutely fascinating. On the specifics, I'm not wildly keen on the idea of shredding £10,000 because I think we can all think of causes that would be better off spent on. But on the specifics of David Beckham, I think it's pretty shameful. Actually, it's one thing for someone like Gary Neville or Gary Lineker to go and, left-leaning people like me to go to Qatar and present the World Cup on the BBC or wherever they're doing it. In the case of Gary Neville, no doubt being a pundit and a commentator. That's one thing, right? It's a totally different thing to take £10 million, if that's what Beckham has done, directly from the Qatar government in order to promote their country. That, to me, seems to be an utterly shameful thing to do and a very disappointing thing to do, because I've, broadly speaking, been a bit of a fan of David Beckham over the years, not just as a footballer, quite like the way he comes across, and I enjoyed the fact that he queued for however many hours he queued to go and see the Queen's coffin. So that's the specifics of it. On the wider issue, Daryl, I do think it's really fascinating, because the more you look into this, and one of the advantages, I suppose, of the World Cup being in Qatar is that it does make us look into it. You look at the Qatari Investment Fund. Qatar owns part of the Shard. It owns part of Harrods. You look at the United Arab Emirates, which also has some pretty draconian laws, somewhere I wouldn't go and spend my life. And they sponsored the Arsenal football stadium. Their sponsorship is everywhere. You look at who owns Manchester City. You look at who owns Newcastle United, for goodness sake, the Saudi Wealth Fund, and we all know what goes on in Saudi Arabia. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, it's all very well that we complain about the World Cup being in Qatar, and I do think it's an absolute farce. It's in a country of 3 million people. You could have spread the love of football to a big country, and It could have been a joyous thing. But it does focus the mind, Daryl, because it makes us remember just how entrenched we are with these regimes.
Okay, that's a good point. Dr. David Waring making that point earlier on the issue of Joe Lycett specifically, Alice. It's so fascinating to see which way people fall on this one. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm so surprised that he's getting... There's been quite a lot of hate on Twitter. I've been looking at some of the comments recently, this evening. And I have a huge amount of respect for Joe Lycett as a comedian. I think he is incredibly artistic. I think he has incredible wit. I don't agree with him on everything politically. But as I say, I've always respected him. This, in my opinion, this is an artistic statement, and it is designed to shock. People are, going, oh, what on earth? This is 10 grand. Well, this is, not even a drop in the ocean compared to the amount that David Beckham is taking from Qatar and his partnerships. But I think we've got to look at it for the bigger picture as well. Football is full of dark money. All the examples that she just given just now about Saudi Arabia owning Newcastle United, it is not new. And I think Qatar is, it's just put it in the focal point, hasn't it?
Sure.
But
is
I
he
don't know.
Funny, guys? Is Joe Lycett funny?
Yeah, he's hilarious. Have you seen it? Watch 8 out of 10 Cats, best bits. He's incredible. And his skit about the parking permit.
I also, that's very good, and he's also very clever, isn't he? The way that he sort of constructs his stuff. I made a point.
He uses intellect, unlike many other comedians that are supposedly good.
And presumably, Alice, you're from a very different political persuasion to him as well, aren't you? And he's
I'd say so.
He's sort of regarded as being left leaning. You regard yourself as right leaning, and do you still? I mean, there's lots and lots of people on Twitter tonight. The quite a lot of them who are getting angry. I've noticed are sort of right of centre, who perhaps are sort of annoyed with him who perhaps aren't necessarily his audience anyway, I guess. I don't know. Do you still find him and his satire and his comedy, watchable and funny, and you can engage with it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I personally wouldn't burn 10 grand of my money as a political statement, but that's his choice. He's earned that money. He's allowed to do what he wants. And that's part of my philosophy,
Yeah, that's right. That's conservatism.
What with it.
There you go.
Exactly.
That's fiscal.
And
Go
his
ahead.
his speech that he gave while he was, describing what he was doing and why he was doing it was poetic. It was, quite funny. And, I think it's the classic phrase, separate the art from the artist. I think people do care too much when it comes to this kind of thing. He's doing it to help what he believes is his worldview, and that's not affecting anyone else.
Sure. I made a point earlier on Twitter that got quite a lot of heat in itself, and I said that this is a statement on discomfort. If you feel uncomfortable about Joe Lycett shredding £10,000, that's the point, isn't it? Because you're supposed to feel uncomfortable. Yeah, it's a statement about feeling uncomfortable about money, isn't it? That's exactly what's at the heart of this. Hey, we're out of time. Oh, I hate it when that happens.
Daryl, we didn't talk about the climate. We didn't talk about the front page of the Guardian climate.
Oh, no.
We did.
Brink of catastrophe.
We didn't, Matthew, but I promise you we're going to talk about it next. It's part of our coverage next. We'll be hearing from the UN's youngest advisor from COP in the next 10 minutes or so, so we've got it covered, sir. Don't worry about it. Matthew Stadlen, thank you for being with us. Journalist and broadcaster tonight. Alys Watson Brown as well with us. She is a journalist and political commentator. Just a quick apology, by the way. There may have been a swear word in the clip of Joe Lycett a little bit earlier on. If you heard anything in that was uncomfortable for you or offensive in any way, apologies.